All right, we're doing our case study on staff shortages from COVID-19. I'm Lainey.
I'm Eduardo.
Caitlin.
Nice. All right. So in our case study, we focused on staff shortages in the healthcare fields and the industry and how it affected all of the individuals that were close to us. We were able to speak to a lot of different people to give a different overview and look at all aspects of the industry and really analyze the problem that's at hand. The problem's slowly being worked on in the fact that the pandemic is still going on, so you can't really erase staff shortages, but it'll definitely be a challenge for a long time. In an online study done in 2020, it was shown that healthcare workers during COVID-19 were burnt out because their hours were overextended and they were exhausted from it. And then 2 years later, the vaccine is now required in most hospitals and facilities, and some individuals don't necessarily agree with that. So people were let go or chose to leave because of this requirement. And so our methods for this case study, we each spoke to personal contacts within the healthcare industry. So we had a doctor and then I think about 6 nurses at different hospitals with different positions. And then we had a clinical lab director. And our interviewees were able to explain and show how COVID-19 really affected their place of work and how it affected the staff, especially the staff. And all of our information was collected from Google Docs, Google Forms, interviews, and surveys. And then for our questions, we asked about 18 formal questions, but most of them were pretty much asking how COVID affected their work life and why they think that there were staff shortages and why people felt like they were being overworked, etc. And mostly just their opinion on why they think that staff shortages were happening because of COVID. Just more questions. For our nurses, most nurses agreed that COVID-19 definitely led to the staff shortages and affected the work life. And they agreed that the interview process was different because from COVID, all the interviews were online instead of in person. And all the nurses, all 6 of them, said that fear and burning out caused most people to leave, which directly correlates to staff shortages. And they also agreed that they were extremely overworked and a lot of people had to leave their unit to go help out with other COVID units just to help with the max people that were coming in. And then additionally, more nurses are accepting travel positions to get better pay, which also leads to staff shortages because travel nurses are not permanent employees.
So we also interviewed a doctor. Dr. Jim Warren is an anesthesiologist who opened up his own pain practice. They actually opened in 2020 during the beginning of the pandemic. And he also agreed that COVID-19 had led to staff shortages. He ran into multiple issues while opening his practice, such as getting his name out and finding funding for the equipment that he needed. The biggest issue that he ran into was finding people who were, 1, willing to come to work, and 2, finding people who were qualified enough for the positions he was hiring for. He is having to train his employees more due to COVID learning. Since the start of COVID, learning had been moved to online, and his employees hadn't had hands-on experience with the equipment that he had in his office. He does not believe that staff limitations had led to people leaving his practice because he doesn't overwork his staff and if they hit about 49 hours, he does make sure that they are compensated for their extra work. The biggest factor, his company does suffer when his employees get COVID because they are such a small business and to hire short-term help. And with the administration cuts, they have been that have been made to physician reimbursement is adversely affecting the ability of he and his staff to provide safe quality care for the patients that they see. The COVID-19 pandemic has affected his business and the size of his staff, but not as severely as the nurses who work in the hospitals.
So another person that we interviewed was Sue Baddick, who is the clinical lab director at Cape Coral Hospital. So after interviewing her, she recently started that position just about less than a year ago, around June of 2021. And that's when the COVID surges were still at an all-time high. So the previous lab director, funny enough, was burnt out and had to drop that position. So she stayed home with her family. Then we have Sue Baddick, who we've interviewed about, huge influx of tests and orders that have been going to Cape Coral Hospital, because what she said was Cape Coral Hospital is the main campus that receives orders from other doctors where, say, Gulf Coast Laboratory doesn't have the right equipment to run a special test. So that's why Cape Coral Hospital receives most of those tests, mainly because of the instruments that we have over there. So one thing that we asked her is if the vaccine for COVID-19 played a significant role in the ability to hire more staff, or if from losing staff. And she said definitely is a huge factor, mainly because we have people who did not feel safe getting the COVID-19 vaccine, or many due to either medical or religious factors, or a few more things. And funny enough, that during her interview processes, how do you say them? As soon as she does hire a new employee, there's the one walking out the door. So she says that having to go through the training and catching people up is affecting everyone in the work environments, because that just increases the workload on the rest of the staff. You can go to the next slide.
So at this point in time, the pandemic is starting to slow, but staff shortages are still an ongoing issue due to what we have said in our results from our interviews. Our team had learned why staff shortages have been so severe, and we've had the opportunity to get many different opinions as to how this problem could be resolved. The biggest issue that we came to find was, of course, burnout, because employees aren't getting enough time to, one, have time with their families, and just time in general being outside of their work environment, whether it's a hospital or a clinic. And also finding well-qualified employees for these open positions. To possibly solve the staff shortage problem, there could be a lessening of nurse to patient ratios, because with some hospitals, nurses are assigned to a certain amount of patients, and with COVID, that ratio has increased quite significantly. Companies could start compensating their employees for extra work if they're not already doing so. And they could also make sure that employees are taking sufficient breaks during their time at work, as well as making sure that their employees are getting time off in order to decrease higher rates of burnout.
So reflecting on this case study, some limitations that we've had was not being able to be in person and actually seeing how the staff shortages are directly affected with the staff facilities we've interviewed. So for example, if one department has a huge amount of workload, how does another department react to that or cope with that? Stuff like that could have been further acknowledge or research to see, the grand effects, how one thing leads to another. So other questions we may have asked is, like, what suggestions would you give to your boss or the person who oversees your department as an employee in order to better help decrease staff shortages and overall morale? There's just a few more things we could have asked that we were limited to on this case study. If you can continue. Yeah, so issues that may have been reviewed in further detail were like specific effects of staff shortages on the effectiveness in patient care and within the work facilities. So if doctors are having the same amount of time with the patients as they did before COVID-19, those are more further details we could have explored, given a longer time period or another departments to study for the case study.
So in the future, we would like to get a better understanding of why staff shortages are still present. We would hope to get to do this in person to get a better look at how healthcare facilities run. And we also want a better understanding as to why facilities labor turnover rates are so high.
These are just our references.
Yep.
Thank
So-
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.